Lions Rock Productions.
This is Jay Moore.
This is Greg Cruz.
This is Dan.
This
Stone.
is Dexter from The
This
Offspring.
is Nathan
This
East.
is Sebastian Younger.
This is David Labb.
This is Stuart Copeland.
This is Mick
I'm
Gillette.
Krista
This is
Vernoff.
Dr. Bob Greenberg.
I'm Laird Hamilton.
This is Rob Bell.
Hey, this is John Leon Guerrero.
Hey, I'm Mark Valley.
Hey, and this is Pete A. Turner.
Hi, this is Jyri Raitasalo. I'm a military professor from the Finnish National Defense University, and you're listening to the Break It Down show.
And now, the Break It Down Show with John Leon Guerrero, Mark Valley, and Pete A. Turner.
Man, this is super cool. One of the things I love about podcasting, Jyri, is that we can reach out halfway across the world, or at least a third of the way across the world. It's 6 o'clock in the evening where you are. It's 9 o'clock in the morning where I am. And here we are, two people that study warfare, and now we're going to have a conversation. Jyri, if you aren't familiar with him, you should definitely go to LinkedIn and look up his work. He's been published on War on the Rocks. He does a lot of writing in a variety of settings and styles. So I'll leave some of that work to you guys. But I wanted to get in with you because I don't want to waste any more time. Give us an idea of what you do on a day-to-day basis and how it impacts Finland and where they go in terms of security.
Well, I think I have two main things. First of all, I do research on the transformation of the character of war, mainly focusing on what the Western states are doing in the post-Cold War era, or have been doing and are doing as we speak. And the second part is take this research business and put it into practice and do teaching, and then guiding some other researchers on their own projects. Okay,
cool. And when you say Western, the Western part of the thing, is Finland included in that, or are you guys sort of in between?
Yeah, yes, Finland is included. Quite a lot of my studies concentrate on NATO, the United States, and most European states. So Finland is on the verge of that. It's a partner nation, not a member state. But of course, I have my own research interest in kind of putting Finland into the perspective of the European Union, NATO, and the West.
Give us an idea, because one of the things I don't have a good grasp of, and I'm sure the audience doesn't, is what is Finland's view? A lot of times in America, we're very self-loathing, and sometimes we're very self-loving. So give us kind of a sense of how you guys view America as a world partner, and then talk a little bit about Finland's role in NATO, in the European Union, all these different areas. Talk about that after we talk about perceptions of America and Finland.
Okay, well, if I start with my notions about the U.S. and some Finnish notions about the U.S., I think everybody understands here that the United States is the only global player, politically or militarily, the only military great power that has global interests and the ability to operate globally. So I do think that it's appreciated that if there is going to be a military crisis in Europe, everybody understands that the United States is hopefully going to be the main player to solve it. So I do think that there's a lot of appreciation for the United States here in Finland and in Europe as a whole. What do we do? How do we view security in Finland? I do think that we have done some little bit more modest changes to our military posture and military doctrine during the post-Cold War era than most European states have. And I do think that that's based on our geographical location next to a great power, which is a military big actor. And also because we have our own big geography, we are quite big state, quite small population. So we are doing mostly the territorial defense capability, constructing it and maintaining defense capability for the defense and deterrence purposes. So we haven't been going that much out of area doing expeditionary missions than maybe most states in Europe have.
What's the population of Finland?
5.5 million.
Okay, so it is rather small. I mean, we have whole cities that are bigger than that. Is there a concern about Russian invasion into Finland since you guys share a border? I mean, I know obviously you're focused on home defense, but is that a problem? Like we have Mexico and we have a constant incursion of people coming across for the opportunity. I don't know that that's the case for you guys, but is a border security a serious strategic concern for you guys?
Well, I think that if you look at Russian borders, the border with Finland has been the most stable and the most well-guarded one. So we haven't had practically any problems with border security. But of course, the rising tensions that we have witnessed in Europe for the last 4 years, that is a concern. It is mostly a political concern. It has some economic aspects as well. We have taken a little bit of a hit on the sanctions and so on. But of course, it's also a defense matter. If things start going sour, of course, we want to be ready so that we have a credible defense and no threats will come to us.
At least a good foundation for what we're about to discuss now, and sort of what are we looking for? I mean, we've seen Russia roll into the Crimea and create conflict there. And from my point of view, and you're welcome to disagree with me, tank on tank, state on state battles are, I hate to say a thing of the past because we've tried that in the past and that's proven wrong, but they're a lot less likely. The fight we fight is much more complex and not as big. It's not a platoon of tanks taking on another platoon of tanks as much as some of my military peers want that to be the case. How do you sort out the complexities of what's next in modern conflict?
Well, I agree with you on the notion that state-on-state wars, tanks on tanks, have become marginalized after the Second World War, actually, during the last 70 years. So we haven't seen too many of those cases. We have seen some, but not too many. Vast majority are internal conflicts, insurgencies, and so on. But I don't think that just because you count more of these newer versions of wars, that they are more important. At least from our perspective, I can really see one big strategic imperative, and that is preparing the military and the defense side so that there is not going to be a war. So it's in a way kind of a preventing threats from emerging, and that is the main reason for having military capability and defense capability in Finland. So I agree with you in part, but I wouldn't draw the conclusion that the most frequent wars are the most necessary or most strategically important. And I'm also talking to the U.S. Just to maybe get the conversation going. I would argue that some of the military operations the U.S. and many other Western states have done during the post-Cold War have actually not produced too many positive security outcomes. So I would say that I would say a little bit more restraint on using the military forces.
Yeah, we definitely struggle to create a repeatable and reliable outcome, especially in terms of creating stability. We hate to turn nation building, but the reality is when someone has to go back to Syria and help them get back up on their feet. Otherwise, as far as we know, they're going to stay mired in conflict and instability for generations. Do we need to?
Yeah, but it's going to be difficult. I think it was John Mearsheimer who has been calling the nation building kind of a military social engineering, and I do think that he has a point, because I do think that when you are using military forces, armed forces, violence, in some cases large-scale violence, to produce social or political outcomes, it's really difficult. Military power does not easily translate into politically and socially acceptable outcomes. In many cases, it actually makes things worse.
I definitely agree with you there. I've seen a lot of great intentions from allied military forces. When we go to Afghanistan, the French aren't trying to mess up, the Romanians aren't trying to mess up, but we don't even have an aligned purpose. So you have Romanians running around afraid of getting killed, which is, of course, very realistic. And so they're out driving over the top of Afghan vehicles, killing Afghans with their trucks, and just scaring the Afghans so bad that we were getting reports that they thought the Russians had invaded. And that doesn't create stability. But what do we do, though? Like with a commander, their job is to impose their will, right? Like whether it's a Finnish commander, an Italian commander, American, they're supposed to impose their will, and you're trying to nurture growth from the local government. How do you reconcile that?
Well, I think that we have a problem that we have to analyze it on several levels. I think what you're talking about is kind of the operational level of how do you do the operation after you get the political decision, what needs to be done. My main focus in my own area of doing things and doing research has been on a strategic level. What should states pursue with their defense policy? What kind of goals can they actually succeed in doing? And I do think that if a commander is given the task of doing nation building and providing stability and security in Afghanistan or some other place, I think, of course, it's his job to do his best. But there could be the situation where he has a task that he or she will never be able to accomplish. Just what you mentioned, so many nationalities in one operation. I think that during the main phases of ISAF in Afghanistan, there were something like 50 plus states in the same operation. And of course, everybody understands that from a commander's perspective, from an operational perspective, it's a nightmare. Trying to reconcile different cultures, different military ethos, different ways of looking at things and doing operations, having some caveats. So that is the problem of getting a big coalition of very different kind of actors with different interests into the same operation.
I'm glad that you talked about the strategy and the outcomes. One of the things that I've noticed is that our theory and our strategy rarely links with the tactics on the ground. And this kind of goes back to where we started with this whole thing with this. On the American side, we've got a security blanket with our tanks, with our artillery, with our military dominance. I mean, this is what kind of makes state-on-state fights obsolete, because who can afford to fight like that in terms of attrition and material and money? It's very, very hard. So when we get down to the tactics on the ground, what does the U.S. military train on? Well, a tank unit about to deploy to Afghanistan that's going to partner with and spend most of its time engaged with Afghans in teaching, training, creating capacity. They're going to go to our National Training Center and they're going to practice tank-on-tank fights and literally never touch a tank outside of the camp the entire deployment. So they actually don't work on the tactical skills that might lead to success. And then the other thing I've realized, and take your comments on this, is from tactics, the leap to ground truth is enormous, and we are terrible at understanding if the tactics we are training actually connect with the reality on the ground. What are your thoughts on that whole concept?
Well, I've been following the discussion in the US and also in Europe, and I would say that of what I understand it, that during the last almost 20 years, there has been a shift. It has been quite a remarkable shift of moving away from tank-on-tank thinking, doctrines, and instigating this notion of counterinsurgency and war amongst the people, or three-block war, however you want to call it. So actually, I do think that not so much maybe in the US, but quite a lot in Europe, we have actually seen the loss of the tank-on-tank perspective, the big war perspective in a way. And in a way that is problematic, because if there comes a situation where big wars are coming back, it will take a generation to reinstate the big war perspective. All the capabilities have been axed. For example, in Europe, militaries have gone professional, which means they are very small. In many cases, they are tiny. And then they don't have the equipment, nor the training, nor the ethos. So it will take 20, maybe 15, 20, 25 years to get it back. In the US, you have the capability, but I would say that you have quite a lot also changed the mindset and the training as well. And as I've been looking at the discussions and debates in the US, there has been also the kind of the worry within the military and the defense establishment that it is going to take quite a long time to get rid of the wear and tear that the Afghanistan and Iraq and other operations have done for the military capability, and then in a way getting at least some of the big war mentality back.
Yeah, the big war mentality is the thing. And as we're talking about, less state-on-state war and less tank-based fighting, here's Russia invading the Crimea. And so we have to always kind of keep this root of if you don't focus on this capability, someone will take that advantage and enhance their ability to achieve a strategic win by just relying on that multi-generational deficit in training. And that's a real thing. But how do you manage the resources to maintain enough traditional capacity and yet deal with like we talked about, the extreme cultural complexity of dealing with a Syrian nation-building operation, creating stability in the Horn of Africa, all these other places that we need to try to create stability to handle our theoretic and strategic goals.
Yeah. Well, as I see it, I think it was really logical for the first 20 years after the end of the Cold War. There was really nothing that meant that there was any need for a big war capability for most Western states. So I think it has been rather, in a way, systematic way that they have dismantled a lot of this capability and doctrines and so on. But if I look at the situation in the world today and project it into the future, I would say that for the United States and for the West, we must kind of recognize that the great power rivalries are coming back. I think for the US, it's going to be long-term main rival is going to be China. Whether it's just rivalry or competition, or whether it goes into the military sphere as well, we will see. But I think that the United States needs to focus on great powers more than it has so far. China, number one. On the short term, it's Russia. It's in Europe as we speak. But I think that the prospects for Russia's future are rather bleak. So if you look at the demographic, we look at economics, and we look at the innovation, the power of attraction, soft power, they are all kind of going down. So this is, I do think that you can't control all the bad things and all the security issues in the world with the military. So you have to narrow a focus, and I would say that you have to narrow your focus now, trying to show restraint, get rid of some of the operations that are ongoing, and not to start new ones unless vital national security interests so demand.
Okay, yeah, no, that's, vital security interest. And I guess we could talk about that too. But you mentioned China, and since North Korea is probably the most, at least from our point of view, given that they're a nuclear power now and they have what appears to be an ICBM, what do we do? I mean, we've had Dr. Taguchi on the show, and he's a force planner in the U.S. military. He's retired now, but he talked about maintaining a status quo with North Korea because Kim Jong-un, as crazy as he is, he's the guy we know. We have the networks built up to understand what he's doing. But how do you, as a scholar, and how do you, as a person from Finland, how do you size up this North Korean chess match?
Yeah. Well, as you mentioned, it's easy for me to give advice looking at it from Finland and to see how this influences the United States. But I would say that, and I do sincerely believe that Kim Jong-un's regime is a rational actor, a rational state actor, which is very repressive, authoritarian, dictatorial system. But still, I do think that they have their own survival at stake all the time, and that is what they think about when they do their move. So I don't think that it is crazy actor that would just launch a nuclear or conventional war out of the blue just because they feel like it. So in a way, I do think that deterrence is one way of containing North Korea. The other part, I would say, we have given quite a lot of time and exposure to North Korea. Up until the very latest nuclear tests and missile tests, I think that we should have maybe not respond so actively all the time when they do their move, because that is what they want. When they fire their missiles and they do their nuclear tests, that is what they want. They want to be part of the discussion. They want to be included in the discussions, and now, as we are seeing this new phase about some reconciliative comments, it is a game, and they're trying to play with their very bad hand. They are not doing that badly either.
Yeah, they're not doing that badly, but you're right. They struggle as a regime to feed and provide for their people. And then we as the world we squeeze out all the rest of the stuff to make it possible. So then they have to work with the only other players on the board that will work with them, which are all of the most nefarious, underhanded types of people to survive. And so it does sort of create this well of bad things that ultimately has to be dealt with by somebody. Is when we get to these kind of things where like Syria just continues to get worse and worse, and the Horn of Africa, and I'm just picking a couple places that matter to us, but is that the U.S.'s job to bring its allied power?
Brad Company till the day I die.
Hey, it's Pete A. Turner from the Break It Down Show. If you're in Southern California this weekend, I want you to come check out Brad Company's latest event at Los Cabos Sports Bar and Grill in Lake Forest. This weekend, it's Dave Hatch's birthday, so Brad has put together a show featuring comedians Matt Balaker, Bo McFarland. Of course, Brad's going to be there, and we're even going to get David Hatch to do a set. That's at Los Cabos from 7 to 9 on April 28th. And if you're one of the many fans from all over the world who can't quite get there, do me a favor, check in on Brad's live stream channels. Give a quick high five as he broadcasts Saturday night. That sure would mean a lot to me. Hey, back to the show.
To these places to try to create stability so that instability isn't exported?
Well, my personal opinion is that it's not the U.S. job, but I do understand that many people around the world and also many people in Europe expect the U.S. to lead. So there's a lot of expectation that if something can be done, whether it's militarily or otherwise, everybody is looking at, or most states, at least within the Western security community, are looking at the United States. So it kind of builds a little bit of pressure. But I would say also that the mainstream view within the United States foreign policy establishment has been that active engagement is something that is called for the credibility of the U.S. Global position and so on. So there's a kind of this reinforcing processes outside and inside of the U.S. that have facilitated that the United States has been very involved in the security dynamics during the last 25 years. And my personal feeling is that the dynamic is about to change, and it's going to be more defined by the bigger players that have been absent for 20 years, but have now, in a way, re-emerged. China is doing the long-term growth path, and Russia now playing very actively and aggressively also against the interests of many Western states.
Does Russia's aggression, is that linked directly to Putin's involvement? And then is there a movement back towards a less aggressive, more I guess, collaborative Russia once he's no longer in power? Is that a fair assumption?
Well, I don't know. Is it going to be easier or more difficult with the next leader who comes after Putin? I don't think that we have too many kind of ideas how that's going to turn out. But I would say that the important thing is that it's a dynamics. So it's not only about Russia, and it's not only about the West, or it's not only about China. It's always a dynamic that has at least two, in most cases, more players. If you look at Syria, I don't even know how many players there are at the moment. There are dozens of interests. There are dozens of groups using military force for their own interests. So Syria has become a mess that is really hard to solve. And in a similar vein, this aggressive behavior by Russia against Western interests, it is something that one state or one actor cannot solve, and you can't blame everything on just one actor.
Yeah, that's for sure. Although here in the U.S., we like to blame our president. He certainly creates some intrigue and some excitement around here, and I guess I owe it to the audience to ask, and you don't have to answer, but what would you say overall is the Finnish impression of our president and of what the U.S. is doing right now as a country? Well,
as I understand it, if we look at the policies, most of the policies show, in a way, continuation of older policies. There are some very kind of media hype things where the president comments a little bit differently or quite a lot of differently than his predecessors. But I do think that there is quite a lot of continuity in the actual policies and the practices of what the U.S. is doing. So there are, of course, tariffs on steel and aluminium and so on, singular things, not ordinary in a way, but a lot of continuity. So in a way, the first expectations after the elections were maybe a little bit worse than what has been actually the policies that how people judge them.
Let's talk about hybrid warfare and be done with the presidential conversation. Give me an idea of what, as an expert, actually, let me read this one piece to you from your piece on War on the Rocks, because I thought this was really interesting as you tried to describe the hybrid warfare concept and its viability. But the Russians' ability to to create information campaigns and cyber attacks. So you wrote, second, it's been argued that information campaigns and cyber tools at the disposal of Russia have had a significant influence on the crisis in Ukraine. This is from 2015. And so far, no one has convincingly shown the real tangible effects of Russian information warfare, its army of internet trolls, and the use of other cyber attacks. How has that statement held up over the last couple of years?
Well, for me, I have been a little bit puzzled that when we look at the crisis in Ukraine, both the Crimean Peninsula first, which was a military operation, even if people call those green men, uniformed, highly armed, militarily organized people coming in. So it was a military operation, and we have seen a military operation continuing in the eastern Ukraine for 4 years. And quite a lot of the discussion is about information warfare and hybrid warfare. My point is that actually there is going very conventional long-term attrition warfare as we speak in eastern Ukraine. And if you look at the reporting by the OSCE, every day there is shelling by mortars, by artillery, rocket launchers, some tanks, and so on. So it is rather old-fashioned attrition warfare, low-key but still attrition warfare. And I haven't seen any tangible results from the Russian information campaigns. Everybody, for example, concerning the crisis in Ukraine, everybody knows in the West and understands that Russia is fighting a proxy war there. There is no doubt about that. Russia has become, in a way, a pariah state. It is politically, economically quite isolated as we speak. So I don't think that it has been a success. And at the moment, it looks like the military operation in the eastern Ukraine isn't going that well either. So I don't see how this information or cyber warfare thesis about Russia's action is playing out even today, if we look at Ukraine. Then we can talk about the United States and the election, all that. That is another question.
Yeah, sure. Like that definitely is the natural segue, right? Is then if it's not working there, is it working or did it work in the U.S.?
Yeah, I think there's quite a lot of hype about the information tools, the troll armies still today, and also cyber warfare. But I haven't seen cyber warfare today. What I have seen a lot of cyber criminality, 95% or 99% about cyber incidents have to do with criminal activity, and it's targeted against normal persons, citizens, and companies, enterprises, and so on. Of course, there's espionage and all kinds of stealing of confidential material and so on. That is the part of the business. But cyber warfare, I haven't seen any reporting on that. Some people, take the Stuxnet as an example of the centrifuges in Iran, and some others talk about the Bronze Warrior situation in Estonia 10 years ago. I wouldn't say that that constitutes warfare by any definition. War is somehow related to the use of violence, large-scale violence. Cyber domain is a new domain. It's going to have an impact on warfare in the future. But it was already in 1993 when Rand Corporation published the article that cyber war is coming, 25 years ago. So it's going to take some time.
If warfare involves violence, I'm a counterintelligence guy, right? So I'm a spy. So I'm sometimes collecting to create a targeting package to create violence on someone. But sometimes I'm looking at benign things to give a sense for what's going on in town so that we don't just focus on threat. Am I conducting warfare if I'm in a conflict zone and I'm collecting something that doesn't lead lethal consequences driven by my commander?
So yeah, I think that you could do as a person or as a platoon or at the company level, you could do many things in a crisis or in a war that are not violence related. But I would say that you are not in a war zone if there is not the constant threat and the use of large-scale violence. I think that is something else. It can be a crisis, it can be a conflict, it can be a competition, whatever. But if there is not the threat and the use of violence, how does that constitute war? What kind of differentiates influencing somebody and waging war? I do think that influencing somebody or trying to influence other actors, that's normal politics. You use information, you argue, you lie, you bribe, you do many nasty things as well.
Yeah.
But that's normal politics. That's how international relations work. States are not always thinking the best of others. They are thinking the best for themselves, and they are trying to fulfill their national interest.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. One of the things that I've discovered through my own work, there's several elements to winning a modern conflict, and obviously militarily is one of them, and it probably leads the way, because if you don't have military dominance, you're probably not going to win. And then you have to win the fight culturally, socially, politically. You have to account for religion in all of these things if you're really going to create a positive net effect and dominate. So like the Taliban is able to minimize its interaction with all of the allied presence there. They're able to intimidate through religion and through social and cultural and actually security presence. I mean, it's hard to beat those guys back. They just come back. As soon as you turn your back, they walk back up. So they won't engage you, but they will engage the populace. And so the fight has become, from my perspective, and this drives my Clausewitzian friends crazy, but the center of gravity is the civil populace in terms of the modern conflict that I've seen. Is it correct for me to say that? Can the objective of the fight, the civil populace, be something that we have to fight over, and that is a different kind of warfare?
Well, I do think that if you look at the ongoing operations or wars, Afghanistan being one of those, at the operational level, that is the case. But for me, it's really important that before you engage in such an operation and give the commander his tasks, what he must accomplish, you must have a strategic think about what is our strategic level interest in this. Are they achievable with the use of military force and other means? And how do we define victory? What is the case that we are actually seeking to achieve? And when we achieve it, what do we do then? I haven't seen a lot of that done in a very convincing way during the post-Cold War era. So I would say that many cases military force has been used too lightly, with not enough deliberation about the consequences. If I could just cite the operation in Libya, 2011, as an example, I think it was a massive failure for European and Western security. We are going to feel the consequences of that operations for decades to come in Europe.
Yeah, I mean, Libya is a hour-long flight to Rome, from one to the other. So the proximity is terrifying when you look at what's going on with humanity just a few hundred kilometers away, and you're talking about a lot of damage and negative things. One of the things that I figured out through my own work is that affect beats effect. And you talked about in your War on the Rocks article, the introduction of effects-based approach to operations is indicative of what has been wrong in the post-Cold War Western understanding of war. And then you go on about political goals and that kind of thing.
This episode of the Break It Down Show is brought to you by Lions Rock Productions.
That's us.
We publish, evaluate, and develop podcasts just like this one, consult others to build their own, and create associated content and content marketing strategies.
So if you're launching or expanding your social media presence, your business or your personal brand, or if you just want to take your media presence to the next level,
reach out to us on Twitter
at Pete A. Turner
or at JohnLG69
at the Break It Down Show.
There's 1,000 ways to get a hold of us.
Now enjoy the show. Again, if the civil populace is going to be a central theme, and we don't seem to have these open fields to fight in, state on state, division on division, how do we create the desired affect, the response to stimuli that we want? I mean, we can't just count dead bodies because that doesn't lead to victory. We've learned that over and over again. How do we collect the minds that we need to collect, and not for ourselves? Like, Finland doesn't need Afghans to believe in Finland. They need Afghans to believe in the Afghan government. How do we, and is that a correct approach, is to help Afghan leaders collect Afghan elders? Is that the correct thing, or would you say it's something? And again, I'm putting you in a tactical mindset, but that's kind of where you and I have to figure out how strategy and tactics link.
Yeah, that's okay. But before answering that, I would like to say, you mentioned my critique of the effect-based approach to operations. during the post-Cold War era, that shows some kind of a mistake within the Western security community. What I mean by that is that every time you start waging war or you start the new military operations, you actually should have the effects in your mind. What is this supposed to influence? What are the outcomes that we are seeking with the use of military force? So for me, to have to coin a concept that you actually have to define the effects that you want is something that is absurd, because I think every good strategist and a campaign planner would first think about what do I want to achieve, what are the effects that I want to get to, and then start thinking what do I do militarily and using other means to get that. So I do think that the effects are always in your mind when you are planning whether or not to go to war, and when you are waging war, about how you will get your objective. So that was the reason that I criticized this notion, because I think that it's one part of the parcel when you wage war. Then what to do in Afghanistan? Well, I think I have no the operation has been going on for almost 17 years, so I have no kind of a new fresh idea how to win the war there, but my own kind of instinct tells me that it should teach us at least that many of the goals that we and I am talking on behalf of the 50 plus states that have been being a part of the operation, we should really think about what kind of results can we achieve with the military operation, and in which cases are we actually making the situation worse. So trying to look back, and this is easy for me, looking at in retrospect, I think that the first part of the operation, which lasted for something like 6 months, was beating down the Taliban regime. I think that went really well. I was really surprised how well that went. But after that, I think that there has been, in a way, a mission creep, partly because the Taliban has been able to come back, as you mentioned, finding refuge and then coming back. But I do think that the lesson learned for me is that long-term big forces on the ground doing stability, in most cases, will not work. And if it's culturally very different place that we are accustomed to, like Afghanistan, we have no real good knowledge about the culture or understanding. We have been we tried to build a central government in a country that never had one. So I do think that the big lesson learned for me is that minimize this kind of use of military force.
When we move as a world entity and we try to help Afghanistan, because when you have 50 nations partnered, that's about as worldly as we can get right now. Is Finland doing enough? I mean, I know you guys have a small force. You're 5 million people in the whole nation. When you show up, what can you accomplish? What's your guys' role in a multinational, goodwill festival that Afghanistan is? How do you guys do what you do, and are you doing enough?
Well, are we doing enough? That's a good question. I think that it's a political decision every time whether or not to go, and I do think that at least in Finland, there is always the deliberation about what will our presence bring to the operation. Of course, it will bring, in every case, it brings some amount of legitimacy. The more people or more states participating, it gives legitimacy to the operation. But I do think that there is a deliberation about what can we bring to the table that is beneficial for the operation. So if you look back for the last 25 years, the number of participation has gone down. I think we said something like 1,500 plus or minus in the 90s to different operations, and now the figure is something like 500 soldiers in different missions. So, but I would say that the numbers have been going down. The level of difficulty of the missions and what the soldiers are doing on the ground has gone up. So I do think that we try to do it's part showing solidarity. It's showing solidarity to the people on the ground where the operations are taking place, but it's also showing solidarity to international community, to European Union, NATO, and so on.
That's a great answer. That really, it's just such a great conversation to have with you. I mean, I'm really enjoying kind of picking your brain about things, and it's been one-on-one. But if you want to ask me a couple questions, I'm glad to take a couple stabs at things. I mean, clearly you've got a deep understanding, but I don't want to just hammer you this whole time. Do you want to return serve?
Yeah, well, I'm fascinated by the kind of the notion that, as you mentioned several times, that if we are looking at it from an operational or tactical level, that what can we do? So you have a good history with that. So what would be your suggestion? Is there a fight going on in Afghanistan or potential operation in Syria that is actually doable on a tactical or operational level?
Yeah, I think about this quite a bit because it's an exceptionally challenging answer, and
right.
Who knows if Pete's answer is the right one. The one thing I know, and then if we do have to have a conflict in North Korea, someone has to go there and help to try to get those people up and on their feet. Does that need to be a military operation? I don't know, but does it need to be secured by the military? Probably. So if you're going to go out, because we know this, you can't roll in with tanks, kill a bunch of people, pull out, and expect a good outcome that you want. So given that, yeah, you have to have the ability. My partner and I wrote a peer-reviewed paper. It's actually going to be published in a Scandinavian journal. And
Really?
we talked about female engagement on the battlefield, and just that alone, we called it female empowerment partly because the conversation is already starting once you say female empowerment, because the Western side, the women will attack me and say, which women are you talking about? Our women or their women? Like, okay, their women. Like, they're already empowered. Women are empowered. Like, you're fighting with me. I'm like, this is how complicated this stuff is. Like, I'm not saying that women aren't empowered. I'm saying if we're going to go into a foreign place with limited understanding of their culture, no understanding of their their language, their religion, then we have to slow down and get things right. One of the things that we don't do well, at least in the U.S. military, and I don't know about you guys, but is there's all kinds of advanced step-by-step specific training on how to shoot a gun, how to deploy a claymore mine, how to drive a tank. All these things are very, very specific line item. Like, this is how you do this. This is how you move 80 pounds. This is how you create company in the defense against there's all this doctrine written, but no one can show me the doctrine written for how do you manage an interpreter and turn them into a valuable asset. It's all based on fear and corruption and not reducing risk as opposed to increasing stability. So if we are going to go do these things, we've got to balance the equation a little bit. And in pre-deployment training, you can't, as an artillery unit, you can't just shoot artillery rounds and practice something that you're not going to use on the battlefield, because that's folly. If you think you're going to go into such a complex fight and treat the familiarization and the operation and the partnering with a foreign nation as I don't know how it is in Finland, but I would imagine it's the same way as it is in the U.S. Even special operations type people, SEALs, they're going out all the time and getting into firefights. They will fire fewer bullets than they will have conversations with the locals. Let me say this in a different way. They will have more conversations directed at partnering and stability than they will fire a lethal projectile at the enemy. That's just what happens. So we have to find a way to balance the training and the tools that we have in a way that makes sense. And if that means sacrificing some of our tank proficiency, hey, Pete is fine with that, because I've not seen a tank on a battlefield in a long time, and I've never seen a tank get fired on by a tank in my time in the military. So that's a bit of a long answer, but I think, does that make sense?
Yeah, and I would like to raise one point. You mentioned that in many cases, for example, if something happened in North Korea, that maybe the military tool isn't the right one, but military is going to be the secure and so on. And I think that is a good point, because militaries are maybe not kind of meant to do most of the stuff that they have been doing for the last 25 years, nation building and so on. But they are the only ones that have some kind of tools to do something. Mm-hmm. And I think that's the problem, because if you look at, for example, the Fragile State Index, which classifies states, for example, all over the world, how stable or fragile they are. If you look at Africa alone or the Middle East, you can find something like 30 states that are very fragile. So if you are going to do this the use of military forces, bringing stability and helping states become less fragile, the business is going to be good for the next 50 years and more. And the problem is, are the militaries capable of doing the task, even if they are the only ones that can do something? Because my own kind of thoughts about the ongoing and past military operations, looking back 25 years, is that the militaries are not delivering too much, and that is why, for me, it states that we need to redefine the tasks and the operations that we actually want to engage in.
Yeah, just going back to the female empowerment thing, part of that whole philosophy is if you're going to do female empowerment operations and reliably create a positive outcome, one, you have to make mistakes. That's Pete's number one law of stability operations, is the first mistake is not making mistakes. And when you go out and you engage with women, it's got to first start with the commander's ethos. Their ethics has to be such that female engagement is handled with command influence. It's got a defined goal and outcome. You're not just going to go visit a village once and claim victory. Like, this is real visceral, hard stuff. So if the commander can't redefine ethics and pull away from, at some point, I think you reach an ethical saturation where you can only do so many good things, and then once you reach that saturation point, you can't reliably create a good thing. So you have to train hard so that if a fight comes, you can withstand it. That's an ethical, appropriately responsibility for a commander. They have to train on that. But then you can't also reliably go empower females, create rule of law, improve agriculture, because you have to focus all of your energy on combat. So given that, without an orientation change there, you can't go on to the next step, which is engaging the elders, because the elders are the government. And if they're not prepared to deal with female empowerment operations from a foreign power, then that's where the work begins. Not in the village engaging women, but engaging the men and determining what it takes to advance this objective. And then once you get the permission and the buy-in from these people, and it's not forced, they're like, yeah, this is something it's time to do now, then you can go and reliably engage the women. And that alone is hard, but that's so far down the scale that you can't even get really past the commander stuff very reliably, because units rotate in too frequently and they lose the capacity as they change in.
Yeah, and I do think that the problem is that in many cases the mere presence of foreign militaries on some countries' soil is creating quite a lot of resistance. So it is really hard to take a military force and do female empowerment or some other nation building or whatever that is, because it will automatically mean that there are interested parties within the state where the operation is taking place that have an interest that the foreign military gets out. So it's going to be easy to cause havoc and disruption, but it's going to be really difficult to bring stability. There is always those people who will have the upper hand in a way of showing that this is not working, and this is not working for the long term. So that's why, again, I would say caution when starting an operation, even when our kind of affective side tells us that this we need to do. But it could turn out so that even if our intentions are very good and humanitarian, we may actually bring a lot of misery and prolong the situation. As I would say, what we have witnessed in Iraq and Libya, for example.
Yeah, you're right. And you identified another one of my laws in stability operations is just your mere presence creates instability is the norm. And so when the Finnish military and the French military, when the US military, when they show up, they contribute to that norm. They contribute to the instability, and it's elastic. You can try to create stability, but the moment you pull back from that, there's nothing to shore up that. Instability is the norm. It will always go back to that, and it's very, very tough to defeat that.
Right.
Yeah, it's a challenging thing, but is that where our military needs to focus, though? Is it on these less lethal gray zone operations? Is that where our focus needs to be? I mean, do we need to get further from large scale conflict and really work on mastering these affect-based operations?
Well, I would say totally the opposite. I would say that actually now it's time to refocus on the great power things again after our experiences during the last 25 years concerning the gray zone or hybrid warfare. I would say that the threats, gray zone threats and hybrid threats, they are mostly influencing other authorities than the military. There are some military aspects to it as well, but it's quite a lot on other authorities. So in a way, you need to have resilience in your societies and in your states. Majority of gray zone is not a military thing. It's a lot about use of information, and it's about threats, and it's about terrorism and so all that. And I would say that terrorism is not a military threat mostly. We can use military tools against terrorism, and I do understand that is fine in some cases. But the highly militarized kind of a policy that we have had hasn't produced too many good results. So I would say that we are not able to kill enough terrorists at the rate that we are actually producing new ones.
So if we do move towards working on those bigger military motions, does that, and the most powerful man in the world, we always say here in the United States, is the president. And if you've got this enormously powerful military that does big military movements well, how do you keep them in Kansas in the middle of the nation? I mean, you're almost compelled to use them. Is that, at least in terms of the U.S. as a world partner and always trying to do things, how do you keep that powerful military out of the fight then, if that's what you focus on? How do you not create more conflict by having this powerful machine?
Well, if you look back 25 years, I do think that there has been surprisingly many military operations by the West in a situation where the West, Europe and the United States have been extremely secure. There has been practically no existential threat for the last 25 years, none. And still there have been so many different kinds of military operations, almost globally. So I do think that we have already stumbled on the notion that the military force needs to be used actively, and I do think that we need some restraint in that. It's a policy issue. It's also an issue about what kind of militaries do you have, and how often do you want to intervene. As we started this discussion of talking about the foreign policy establishment in the U.S. and also in Europe, favoring a kind of active role in managing global threats on a global scale. I think that is something that we need to think about. In which kind of cases and where are the military tools going to be useful? I think the militaries are quite crude, even when we have nation building, training and CIMIC and so on. The militaries are rather crude tools, and we shouldn't forget that.
They are crude tools. I've hung out with these tools in bars and everything. We are a crude lot. The most powerful statement I think I've ever heard in all of the thousands of conversations I've had with locals, and I've said this on the show a bunch of times, but I'm going to keep on saying it, is there's only room for one sword in the scabbard. And if you get down at that ground truth level and you really focus on that, that has to be someone other than the commander. But I think you're right. At the strategic level, that sword has to be, I'll say from our point of view, has to be the U.S., because we have the capacity. We can bring in Finns, we can bring in Swedes, we can bring in Germans and work in tandem, and we can make sure that everybody's fed, there's enough fuel, you guys aren't breaking your entire budget. We export security. It's what we do. It's interesting, and I don't feel like we've even scratched the surface on what we can talk about here, because I definitely want to get into a couple things. I'm going to I'm going to give you one more question of me if you want it. But first, let me just ask you this. What's your take on females in combat roles? We're learning about this here in the U.S. now. There's a lot of consternation and worry. What are your thoughts?
Well, in our system, we have had females in the military approximately 25 years, becoming in a way normal, commonplace, so that everybody understands and it doesn't raise eyebrows anymore. So I do think that in our case, where we mainly focus on defense capability for our own area, for our own protection, and we have the military system of having citizen soldiers, big reserves. So I do think that it's a good thing that we have males and females also, voluntary females, as part of our wartime troops.
All right. Yeah, I agree too. From my experience, I've seen a lot of females in combat roles, and they do just fine. Are they as good at men at all things? No, but that's also true of men. They're not as good as women at other things. So that's good. Hey, do you got a last question for me before we wrap it up?
Yeah. Well, I could ask you about North Korea. Do you see, looking at it from the U.S., how do you see it? Is it actually something that might demand military action if the diplomatic efforts now will turn sour?
Well, I mean, if the diplomatic efforts turn sour, I think we reach a military inevitability. We have to do something. The problem is that South Korea is a fully stable, world-class nation, and we can't just throw that away. And of course, China has a role, so it's something that it can't just. Gosh, I hope it's not just something that's done by our president in terms of bringing something large in. I do think that we might see some kind of surgical strike where, okay, listen, we're going to bring you back to the table, but we're going to do that by hitting these things. This only gets worse if we go down this road and they're compelled to come to the table because of that. I think that's the escalation that we do, kind of like we did in Syria, where Syria crossed another line. And so then our president said, okay, well, we're going to blow up this airfield. And, there's some back channeling that happens. Putin knows in advance, clear people out of this area. This is going to happen. Pick a target from these three. And then, it goes out and the attack is completed. I can see something like that happening. I hope that isn't bigger, because as a guy that has to go fight these kind of fights, I sure as heck would rather stay home and not have to go deal with this.
Well, I'm all for diplomacy as well.
Yeah, political answer is the best. Okay, so let me wrap everything up here. Hey, where can people find more about you? How do we? I mean, you're right now. You're this mysterious military Finnish officer. How do we find out more about what you do, what you write about, and get to know your work a little more?
Well, you can look at my LinkedIn profile, Jyri Raitasalo, JYRIRAITASALO. So I have my work there, so you can look what I've been writing.
And I'll put Jyri's LinkedIn profile in the show notes, and be glad to give it to everybody. If you want to reach out and you can't remember that and you can't spell Jyri because he's Finn, so it spells a little different than you might expect. But you can reach out at me at Pete A. Turner or at breakitdownshow.com on Twitter, and I will be glad to get you over to where he is at. Man, I would love to come back to you, and anytime you have something you want to talk about, boy, I would love to have you on, because the more worldly we can keep this show, the more we can all get to know each other and get along better.
Pete, I really enjoyed the discussion, and I also feel that we just scratched the surface, so I will be glad to continue someday in the future.